Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for the Truth in Accounting Ask the Experts. We're thrilled to have you. And today we're going to talk about the financial report of the United States government. The government's fiscal year ends on September 30th. And the financial report was theoretically released on February 17th. And on March 2nd, we finally were able to pull it off of the internet. Chuck, are we getting too much background noise?
Yes, you're getting quite a bit.
Okay, let me try to go somewhere else. Sorry. So in the financial report, there's a lot of very useful information. It is very large. And
Sheila, why don't you just do a quick introduction, hit mute, and move on?
Okay, I'm good. Sorry, thanks. So Chuck is, for all of you who are on the webinar, if you can go ahead and just, there's a Q&A button at the bottom, and you can click on that and put in any questions that you have as Chuck is talking, or anything about Truth in Accounting or our reports. That would be great. And as Chuck is recommended, let's go ahead and just get started with his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. So this is a 258-page report that Janet Yellen, head of the Treasury Department, put out. And they do that each year. And I congratulate the Treasury Department because this year they got it done in February, whereas last year they did it in May. The good news is that they did it in advance of the State of the Union address by the president. The bad news was there was no mention in the State of the Union as to the financial condition of our union. So I'm going to start by highlighting the four most important pages in this 258-page report so that you don't have to read the whole report. And I'm going to start by going to last year's report that came out in 2021. So Sheila, if you'll pull up a screen share there. So there's three numbers on the government's position here I want to highlight from 2020. The first is the budget deficit, which is $3.1 trillion. And you can see that was a big increase from 2019, but that was a COVID year. So the second number, that $3.1 trillion deficit, led to a net total deficit at the bottom there, $26.796 trillion. So in 2020, we had a deficit of $26.796 trillion. And that's terrible. However, because of the change in social programs, our financial condition for the United States was much worse. The bottom of this page shows sustainability measures over 75 years in trillions. So you can see a number there to the lower right, 30.5 trillion. Circle that one. And that's how much in 1 year's time in 2020, the United States fiscal position deteriorated in 1 year. 30.5 trillion worse in 2020 versus 2019. So now we'll go to the next page, which will be the current 2021 report that just came out this month. And you can see the budget deficit there for 2021 fiscal year ended September 30th was 2.775 trillion. So down from the 3.1 trillion the year before, but still terrible. So Sheila, you don't have to underline everything, just circle the three numbers, please. The second number is the 29.885 trillion. So there you see that our deficit worsened because in 2021, when you have a $2.8 trillion deficit, it gets added to the total. So cumulative now, we're nearly $30 trillion in a federal budget deficit. And you hear that $30 trillion quite often spoken in media reports and in the press. Now, if we go down to the bottom of the page, you see the sustainability measures over the next 75 years, the forecast. And remember, last year, this got 30.5 trillion worse. Well, in 2021, it got another 18.1 trillion worse. So over the next 75 years, the total federal non-interest net expenditures is 97.6 trillion. So in 2 years' time, 2020, it was 30.5 trillion worse. 2021, it was 18.1 trillion worse. In 2 years, add those two together, you get 48.6 trillion. Over half our country's problem has just come about in the last 2 years, which is astounding. So how can this be? And what is the detail of this 18.1 trillion worsening in 1 year's time? So we'll go to the next page. And these are the 75-year projections and assumptions and what caused our 2021 problem. So I'll start with the total receipts. The change from year to year, the government thinks now, just compared to a year ago, that over the next 75 years, the federal government will collect 37.3 trillion more in taxes. In 1 year's time, the government has changed its assumption that it's going to get 37 trillion more dollars in taxes from all of us. And that's because there are so many more people now employed and wages are going way up. And why are wages going way up? Because inflation is going way up. So from the government standpoint, hooray, hooray, they're going to collect a lot more taxes. So it should fix our problems, right? No, because while inflation drives the tax receipts up, it also drives the spending up. So you go down to the total of the spending, and you see that over the next 75 years, the government is expected to spend 55.4 trillion more than they thought they would spend a year ago. A year ago, they thought they'd spend 374.9 trillion. This year, they think they'll now spend 430.4 trillion. That is an enormous increase in spending, and it outmatches the presumed increase in taxation. So what are the parts of that? So we'll go to the spending details. Stay on this page. Social Security is estimated to spend an additional 7.7 trillion. Medicare Part A, which is the hospitalization, 2.3 trillion more. Part B, Medicare Part B, which is doctors and various other supplemental medical costs, and D is the prescription drug. Those two combined, an additional 3.4 trillion. But here's the real problem. In 1 year's time, the federal government now thinks they will spend 14.2 trillion more on Medicaid. Now, what the heck changed and happened in Medicaid? And for those of you who don't know, Medicaid covers the people below a certain income level. I believe that income level right now is $17,774 per year. So if your income level is below that, you get a medical benefit from the federal government under Medicaid. So many more states have adopted the federal government's offer to expand Medicaid if the states would share in the costs. And there are now 39 states that have agreed to share with the federal government the costs. And why does a state agree to do that? Because the federal government subsidizes it to a large extent. And to some extent, states view this as, quote, free money for them to help support the medical costs of those lower income people in their state. But in 1 year's time, that expenditure estimate over the next 75 years rose from 37.4 trillion to 51.7 trillion. That is a big increase and larger than any increase we've ever seen in the history of the Medicaid program. And it's both a part of more people eligible, more states participating, and higher medical costs all rolled into one. Now, what are the other reasons the federal government thinks in 1 year's time it's going to spend 55.4 trillion more than it thought last year? Well, there's a category there, and it's called other mandatory, and it's 12.1 change year over year. So $12.1 trillion of other spending. Now, last year, amazingly, when I gave the same talk, that number was 13.1 trillion change. So in 2 years' time, the federal government has allocated 12.1 plus 13.1, $25 trillion more to other spending. Now, I criticized this last year and I'll criticize it against this year. They should not be posting such huge increases without detailing what it's for in a schedule. And certainly a $70.6 trillion estimate of spending for other deserves to be further detailed, at least what the biggest categories are. I believe this includes federal employment benefits, VA benefits, unemployment insurance, food stamps, housing subsidies, and all kinds of other programs. But I also am beginning to think more and more that this other spending is a plug figure to balance their accounting. I have a feeling there are some accounts that don't square up and they just, if you put it in other, it'll balance. So that other category is way up. As is non-defense discretionary spending, up 14.9 trillion. So these are a lot of COVID programs and other programs associated with getting the American economy back on its feet. So the difference between that additional spending of 55.4 trillion and the 37.3 trillion of more taxation over the next 75 years gives you an adverse impact of 18.1 trillion. And over 2 years, remember that adverse impact over 2 years is 48.6 trillion. Just enormous. So now we go to the next page. And this gives further views of demographic and economic assumptions that are behind the figures you saw on the earlier pages. You can just scroll up a little more, Sheila, so we can get more of the numbers. Nope. Go back to that page, just scroll it up if you can. Okay. There you go. Thanks. So I'll start with the demographic assumptions. Not a lot has changed from the prior year. So I won't really go through all that detail of life expectancy and fertility rate and our death rate, et cetera. I do want to spend a moment on net annual immigration. So in 2020, the Treasury Department forecast that we would have 1.418 million net annual immigrants. Now they took it way down to 680,000 net immigrants in 2021. Well, the first thing you should know is this includes both legal immigration and illegal immigration. And all the news reports I saw last year is that we had 1.7 million illegal immigrants coming into the United States just on the southern border. We had hundreds of thousands of others that weren't stopped. And to see how much the Immigration and Customs Department is reporting the flood of illegal immigrants coming into the United States, to see a drop of over 50% forecast, not only for 2021, but for each year of the next 10 years, astounds me. I don't think this is a good number or a good assumption. And I should clarify that these 10-year increments are the assumed rate of change each year for each of the 10 years. So on this table, annual immigration is expected to increase 680,000 per year for 2021 and 22 and 23 and 24, et cetera, until it gets to 2030 when it goes up to 1.3 million. And then you can see it stays between 1.2 million and 1.3 million for the next 75 years. But the Treasury Department is assuming immigration is going to be at an all-time low for this decade. And I just think that's way off. So that's one comment. Now we go back down to the economic assumptions. And I'll start with inflation, since that's the hot button issue. CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So the Treasury Department now thinks that each year for the next 9 years, we will have inflation of 3.1% per year. And this is an increase. Last year, they thought for the 10-year period, we would have an average inflation of only 2.3%. And why did they take it up so little? Well, remember, last year, everybody thought inflation is going to be transitory. It's not going to last. It's just a supply side problem. It's going to be solved. When it's solved, inflation will come down. Well, remember, this report is as of the end of fiscal year 2021, which ended September 30th of 2021. And we now know, sitting here in March of 2022, that inflation over the last 12 months has actually averaged 7.9%, and in the last 3 months has averaged 8.4%. So it's actually much higher than this 3.1 and accelerating higher still. So maybe it will come down, but right now that assumption looks low. So okay, inflation's going up. How much are wages going up? Well, you can see right above that, wages are assumed to increase 6.2%. So that's a big jump. Last year, they assumed 3.5. Now they saw how low the unemployment rate is, how hard it is to hire people in almost every industry, and therefore wages are rising. Well, wages also need to rise because costs are rising. And it is this assumed rise in wages and the number of people being employed that drove that earlier huge increase in new taxes. Remember I said we were going to get 37 trillion more in taxes? Well, it's from people making a lot more money and a lot more of them earning it. So the combination of those two, if real wages go up 6.2%, and CPI goes up 3.1, then the differential is a 3.2% increase real wage for workers, which is a good thing as long as inflation doesn't run faster than that. Now I'll go down to total employment. The assumption here is that the total employment is going to be at 2.7% per year for the next 9 years. So that is actually up from last year's assumption of 0.9. So again, more people employed, a good thing for the economy. Below that, you have average interest rate. And this one, I don't agree with. The Federal Reserve has told us they're going to raise interest rates. They're going to start this week, probably by raising it 0.25%. Various Wall Street forecasters predicts 5, 6, 7 quarterly point increases. But the Treasury Department is saying that they're going to assume only a 1.5% average interest rate for each of the next 9 years, before it then goes to a normalized 4.7%. So last year, the assumption on interest rates was 2.3. This year they took it, or 2021, they took it down to 1.5, when we know that it has gone down in 2021, but it's going to go up a lot more in 2022 and 23. And I don't see there's any way that it's going to stay at 1.5 and then suddenly be at 4.7 in 2030 and beyond. Interest rates normalized in today's world are probably 2.5 to 4, not 1.5. So by assuming a lower average interest rate, the Treasury Department can also assume a lower cost of all the debt and deficit spending, and therefore not as bad a fiscal position as if suddenly they had to raise the assumed rate of interest they would pay on the government debt. All right, so next we'll go to costs, assumed costs. And we have a big jump in hospital insurance. Per beneficiary hospital insurance is assumed to go up 8.2% per year for 9 years. That is a big jump. Last year, the whole decade of the 2020s, the Treasury Department assumed only 5.2. So in 1 year's time, they assume a big jump, 3 full points in per beneficiary hospitalization costs. And right below that, in the supplemental medical insurance, a 13.1% increase per year for 9 years assumed. Now, these two numbers, hospital and the supplemental medical, are way higher than they were previously. And why is that? Well, we know COVID kept a lot of people out of the hospital for voluntary procedures. So all the people who needed hip and knee replacements or hernia fixes or shoulder repairs, et cetera, all those medical procedures were being delayed and put off while the hospitals were full of COVID patients. So it made sense that hospitalization costs on other things besides COVID had gone down. And now that you have the backlog of voluntary procedures unleashed, hospitals are going to be full for years and years and years, as assumed here. So this is very rapid inflation in the medical cost field. Not so much on drugs. In fact, we're going to see, according to the Treasury, a decline in drug prices that is going to be small but consistent. So it's really the medical costs that are assumed to go way up. So now we'll go to the next page. These are, again, assumptions over the next 75 years. So this is the final page that I think is the most important. This is page 204 of the report. And it includes an infinite horizon for hospital insurance, supplemental medical insurance, and Social Security, which is the OASI SDI program, Old Age Survivor and Disability Insurance. That's Social Security. So why look at an infinite horizon versus a 75-year horizon? Well, over 75 years, you know what you can project what you're going to spend for various beneficiaries for each of the 75 years, but it ends and it truncates, including all the people, all the young people who have paid in, but have an expectation of receiving additional, not their own benefits for Medicare and Social Security when they retire after the 75-year period. So it's the next generation's costs that are really picked up in the infinite horizon. And basically the Treasury Department forecasts this out on a year-by-year basis and then discounts it all back. And here, if you go to the lower right-hand corner, this is the US Treasury Department telling us that as of January 1st, 2021, not the fiscal year end September 30th, but January 1st, the present value of the costs is 166.1 trillion more than the expected receipts from these programs. Present value to today, we are 166 trillion short. And last year, that number was 153.7 trillion for 2020. So again, in 1 year's time, 12.4 trillion worse, including all our programs. And again, this is as of January 1, 2021. If you were to roll that forward to January 1, 2022, which we're already in March of 2022, it's probably up another 10 to 12 trillion dollars. This number is just exploding, and you don't see it anywhere. You don't hear about it in the media. You don't read about it. You read about our current year deficit. You read about our cumulative deficit. They don't talk about the future promises of our social programs. And even the Treasury Department, to their credit, they include an estimate, but it's on page 204 of a 258-page report. And I challenge how many readers are reading 200 pages into the detail to find this cumulative social program cost for the federal government. So I'll end there, but I do want to say last year when we got to the question and answer period, everybody asked the questions, well, how the heck is the United States going to solve this? And my answer is it's impossible to solve other than to have large-scale inflation run for decades. I can't see any political will to enormously expand taxation. Realize they're already assuming 37 trillion more in taxes than they did last year. That doesn't begin to cover it because they spent even more than that. So it's only future inflation that's going to solve this or make the math work. And people ask, well, what do you advocate? I advocate, number one, anybody who listens to this talk, when you hear anyone talk about the annual deficit or the total fiscal debt at $30 trillion or an annual deficit of $2.8 trillion, make sure you stop them. Say, wait a minute, that doesn't include the social programs. Let's add in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, VA benefits, federal employee benefits. the Treasury is telling us we're 166 trillion short, and our economy's 22 trillion dollars in size. So you can't, our hole is 8 times greater than the size of our GDP. It is not solvable by more taxation or lower benefits. It is too far gone. And in 2 years' time, it's gotten 48.6 trillion worse. Again, 48.6, that's twice the entire GDP of the United States. We are deteriorating in our financial condition at a rate that is greater than the size of our entire GDP for each of the last 2 years. That's how enormous the problem is. And I apologize for the bad news. I do these talks because I would like the American public and the taxpayers to know what the federal government is reporting, and you can't see it on any of the news. They don't highlight this. You don't read it in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. So that's why I do these broadcasts, to say this is what the Treasury Department is telling us is going on, and we need to have Congress at least be honest and transparent about the reporting of this.
Well, I don't know if I should thank you or not thank you, Chuck, but it's very important information for people to understand and know. Our listeners, if don't forget that you can put your questions in our Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Just scroll over that and where you and just put any questions for Chuck. One question is, in the corporate world, and I've heard a few of and read transcripts of like Warren Buffett's report to his stockholders. In the corporate world, when the financial people or the president or CEO talk to their stockholders, do they mention their financial position, or is that something glossed over like it is in government?
Well, number of things. First, the corporations report much quicker than the government. They have to file with the SEC, a public corporation does, in less than half the time that the government gives itself. Second, they do include all their pension and long-term liabilities, and they have to have an assumed payout rate and an assumed investment return rate. Those rates are published in their annual reports and their 10Ks, and they're audited by financial accounting firms that have to say whether they agree with the accuracy of those assumptions. Now, I will mention that on long-term pension plans for corporations, maybe 5 years ago, the assumed rate of return over 30 years on their pension investments was about 8% a year. That has come down steadily, and it's probably now a range of, I've seen as low as 3.5% and as high as 7.5% assumed pension returns for 30 years from corporations. But at least you can go to the table in the back, in the appendixes, see their assumptions, see that the accounting firm is opining on those assumptions. The federal government just makes these assumptions up, puts them out there, and you don't hear anybody comment on whether they think they're accurate or not. Obviously, the Treasury Department just says, these are our assumptions. And I'm sure they talk to a lot of economists and to arrive at those assumptions. I just think it's worthwhile for a taxpayer like me to comment on what they think is realistic or not. Plus, I should acknowledge I have the benefit of hindsight because we have an extra 5 months. So we have more current information than when these financial reports were published.
So why do you think that, it always astounds me in the State of the Union, wouldn't you think that the financial state of the union would be important? And why do it's not just President Biden, President Trump never mentioned it, President Bush never mentions it. Why do the presidents not mention this important information?
Because it's very bad news and it's bad politically. You don't win any votes. In fact, you would not get elected by saying, I'm going to run and I'm going to work on this problem. I'm going to admit the problem. I'm going to start raising taxes. I'm going to start cutting social spending, and I'm going to inflate the dollar. I'm going to do all those things. Well, that would be very painful for all Americans, and they would not vote for any such candidate. So in State of the Union, they're biased to present a positive view of the State of the Union, as opposed to particularly bad news that they can't solve.
Yeah, and our listeners, again, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A feature. Chuck will be happy to work on those answers. Now, you mentioned that the auditors of the financial statements of corporations, and also the auditors of the federal government's financial statements are audited, and unfortunately, they receive, as a CPA, this is a very unusual thing for me to see, they receive a disclaimer opinion. What would happen, which means they flunk their audit, and most of this relates to their Defense Department, where they really struggled taxing things. What would happen to a publicly held corporation if it got a disclaimer opinion?
Well, most public corporations are traded on an exchange, and if you flunked your audit, you would be delisted more likely, or trading would be halted. They wouldn't allow the public to trade in your stock if they could not trust the financials that are being reported to them. The minute there was an announcement that you had flunked your audit, the stock would plummet and the trading would be halted.
Wow. But then it just astounds me that, the largest financial institution in the world, which is the federal government, they flunked their audit, and unfortunately, what would be the consequence we could give them, especially the Defense Department? Are we just, I think they pretty much know that, well, it doesn't matter if we flunk our financial audit, the Congress is going to give us the money anyway.
That's what's happened. Listeners should know that the Defense Department for many years went unaudited. Each department was required to be audited. They couldn't complete the audit. And then it was hundreds of millions of dollars that the Defense Department spent to do an initial audit after not having been audited for many years. And they flunked the audit, and then they spent hundreds of millions more to do more audits, and they flunked again. And at least now the Defense Department is spending money to audit and correcting things that it finds mistaken and missing. However, each time they're reviewed, many more things come up. For example, they didn't even have a record of how much property, how many physical buildings they owned or had. And a lot of the Defense Department is murky because, truthfully, money and arms go to all kinds of countries all over the world for a lot of different reasons. And the Defense Department likes to keep a lot of where the money goes hidden, so the taxpayer doesn't see it going to certain countries. They also want to see it hidden so that opponents around the world don't see where we're spending our defense money on technology and what missile programs or what other kind of programs we're trying to advance. So there's some element of confidentiality that defense hides behind in trying to obscure their numbers. And you're right, Congress, no matter what, and as we see in this example, continues to increase the defense budget.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the talk, in this looking at the four important pages, there was higher inflation and higher wages, and I think that some people say, well, we can quote inflate our way out, but doesn't the higher inflation and the higher wages increase the cost, especially in the medical area?
Yes.
The medical cost increases faster than inflation increases. So is it realistic to think that we could just grow our way out of this?
Well, yes, because it is true that the more inflation, the higher Social Security spending goes up, because it's and Medicare reimbursements. But at the end of the day, the federal government can always print an unlimited amount of paper and hand it out to people as payment.
So I think what you're saying, in that situation is that we do need to get, each of us should get wheelbarrows, because at some point it's going to take wheelbarrows of money just to go grocery shopping.
Well, I don't know whether most people know it. Much of the new debt that gets issued gets purchased by the federal government. It's not purchased in the open market by individuals and corporations and foreign countries. It's purchased by the government itself. And when the government itself is the largest buyer of US debt, it distorts the price at which that debt is bought and sold. And they distort it to keep interest rates low, to manage the economy, and you can see where it's led higher inflation.
And now I'm thinking of New Zealand. They, obviously it's a smaller economy, but I just think we need to scale it. They do what we call it truth in accounting, fact-based budgeting, which is full accrual calculations and techniques. And they issue their numbers on a quarterly basis, again, kind of like corporations here do. And they have found that the public, like here, if there's any mention of financial issues in the United States, it's based on the deficit number. In New Zealand, they publish this, net finance, they call it a fiscal position. They publish it quarterly, and so the public takes a look at that and goes, well, did the government increase or decrease our debt? Do you think that's a realistic possibility here, where Congress, after Congress makes a decision, about COVID relief or defense spending, or we could get the long-term consequences of that after they do that, or even another crazy idea would be to do it before they make the decisions. Do you think that's a viable idea, or you just don't think we can do that here?
It's a terrific idea from a taxpayer standpoint to have quarterly publications and forecast of costs before spending occurs. Taxpayers love those ideas. Politicians hate those ideas because they will expose bad things and they will get less votes.
Well, then aren't they kind of using the current and future taxpayers' money to actually buy votes? Is that what's going on?
That has been going on for decades. Surprise, surprise. And it's not just the federal government. It is very much true in state governments and local governments. Think of your local municipality and the police force and the fire department and comes forward and says, we need a raise. We want 5% more. And the city council and the mayors think about it and they say, you know what? We can't give you 5%. Tell you what, we'll give you 2%. And then we'll give you 6% increase in your pensions. And those will be paid out 20 years from now when we, the city council and the mayor, will no longer be in office. Not our problem. And then, as these numbers accrue, like in Illinois and Chicago, they say, well, let's issue something called pension obligation bonds. And we'll account for these bonds as revenue. And we'll only account in our current financial statement for the current year's interest. We'll include that in our financials, but not the other years that we owe on this bond. So imagine a bond issuance, borrowing, being called revenue. And that's how local states and municipalities issue debt and handle their costs of fire and police.
Well, I think one thing that local and state and even the federal government isn't considering right now is that even if they don't say we're going to give you a pension increase, they say we're just going to give you a salary increase. Well, when they do that, they never ask, well, what is that going to do to our pensions? Because the pensions are related to, aren't those related? They say, okay, you're going to get a pension based upon the last 5 years' salaries. So if you increase their salaries, it's going to increase their pensions. But I don't think they consider that. Would corporations consider that when they look at their finances and decide whether they're going to give raises or not?
Well, yes, they have to assume a rate of increase in their wages for their pensions, and it has to be explicitly spelled out in the financials. And
I think it's spelled out, pretty much immediately in their financials. But again, unfortunately, the government's, this financial report of, the United States was issued late. The state and local governments, it's like they're doing a good job if they issue it within 6 months. And when should they be doing budget decisions before, or any financial decisions before the last year's financial statement comes out?
Well, they do. Whether they should or not, they do. And, we're not going to stop that.
Yeah, we're still looking for more questions from our audience, additional questions.
If there are no more questions, we can end it.
Oh, no, we have a couple more questions. One is that in the financial statements, it mentions that over the next, the next 75 years, going with the 75-year projections, that revenues would have to increase by 32% to cover the whole. And the other one would have to, the cost would have to be cut by 25%. Now, do I hear you correctly that you just don't think that those decisions in that and I mean, that would have to start today. So you just don't think that those political decisions to raise taxes or cut benefits to that extent are just going to ever happen?
I think they're going to happen, and they're not going to make a difference. I think they're going to inch out progress and claim victory on an insurmountable problem. That's what I think is going to happen. And in the end, they'll print money to solve the problem. They'll pay, everyone will get paid. You'll get your Social Security check. You'll get your Medicare payment. The dollar will not be worth anywhere near where it is today.
I think that comes to a great question that we have from one of our listeners, Brian. He says that you're predicting, decades of deficits. What strategies could a common person consider to lessen the effect of this inflation for over that long period of time? What should our listeners be doing to, offset all this grim news?
Number one, you don't own any long-term government U.S. debt. A 30-year bond yielding you 3% is going to lose you a lot of money over the next 30 years. Don't own long-term debt. Don't even own intermediate debt. Own real assets. Anything, land, corporations that produce earnings, gold, Bitcoin, apartment buildings, real things will be worth more than they are today in US dollars. And that's been true for quite a while now.
Well, yeah, I think that's great advice, and we really appreciate it. And again, Chuck, thank you for going over those 5 pages. Our national debt clock continues to increase at Truth in Accounting. You can go to our truthinaccounting.org website. Chuck sponsored our federal page on our data-z.org website, so you can go to that and get a more detailed description of the federal financial position. And we do have a weekly, semi-weekly morning call, which is an email that we send out on a weekly basis to people who subscribe. So you can go on our website and get that. Chuck, is there anything else that you would like to end with?
No, I just want to end by reiterating, people on this call will hear people talk about the annual deficit and the cumulative debt. They'll hear $3 trillion annual deficit and $30 trillion cumulative debt. Keep reminding people whenever you hear that it doesn't include the social programs. And tell your kids and talk to your school boards and say to the school boards, there ought to be a course, whether it's in junior high, high school, or college, that talks about review of financial reports of the government, whether it's local or state or federal. We have a citizenry that is not educated in this area and doesn't care. And I would each individual take some responsibility to spread the word.
Yeah, I would say, for the accounting students that I was, a lot of times, it is very, very unusual for an entity to get a disclaimer opinion on their audited financial statements. So if you want to read about a good disclaimer opinion, I hate to say it's good, but to get, details, they talk about the internal weaknesses in internal controls. And, it's just a good report, but again, very few people read it. I remember going to Treasury once, and we were talking about, the Treasury Department was talking about trying to get more and more people to read this report. You can find it on our website. It's on our homepage right now, and you can find it on our data-z.org website also. So at this point in time, I'd like to thank Chuck I think I should thank you, I'm not sure, for this news. It is very important. I really wish others, people would listen, hear about it. I wish our elected officials would talk about it. And since they don't, I would, we have what we call the Financial State of the Union that we include on our website, or you can take pictures of these 4 pages, and every time you see a politician, say, why are you not talking about this? This is what we really should be talking about. So thank you again, Chuck. Thank you for our listeners, and we will see you at our next Ask the Experts.